Hi, Nigel here from lawfulrebel.com. If you're a truth seeker like me, you may well be interested in the impacts of the Father Christmas story. And like me, you may wish to do your part to ensure that truth is valued as that sacrosanct that it should be in our culture as we move forward. And you may want to do your little bit to try and further that in whatever way you can. And so to that goal, I wanted to discuss the Santa Claus story, the Father Christmas story, and how we can approach that in the recounting of that story to our children or grandchildren or any children within our charge. So there's a couple of points I want to make, and they all rest on a very simple change. And the change is this: it's that we present this story, the Santa Claus story, for what it is, a story, and we try not to get culturally on board with the idea that it's true. And there's a lot of pressure to do that with the Santa Claus story. So you got the idea of this jolly, overweight, white-bearded character who flies around the sky in his sleigh pulled by magic reindeer, bringing presents that he's manufactured at his factory in the North Pole, and he distributes them around to all children everywhere across the planet in the space of one night. Now, it's a great story. We've all grown up with it. But the central point I want to make is that it's well worth resisting the cultural tendency all around us to make this whole story as real as possible for young children. And I want to suggest, for a number of reasons, this is counterproductive. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly, young people their faculty of reason, I should say, is in its infancy. They are just coming to terms with what is real and what is not. They are just beginning to learn what they can be certain of and what they can't. And with concepts such as fantasy and the make-believe, it's very important for us adults, first and foremost, to grasp that these concepts only have meaning in contradistinction to what is real. It's reality that we must discover and be fully clued in on first. We have to have both feet firmly in reality in order to then form the concepts of the unreal, of the make-believe, of the fantasy, of the imagined. These only have meaning in contradistinction to what is real. And with young children whose minds are in their formative stages, it serves no useful purpose to insist to them that a particular story is real when in fact it isn't. It doesn't add anything to their enjoyment of the story. I've learned that through watching my own children and others. In fact, children find it more reassuring to have both their feet placed in reality and to know this story is a story, so that they can then be able to dive into it head first, as it were, and fully enjoy the make-believe, the wonder, the magic, the unreality. To get fully lost in the unreality is to be able to dive into that box as distinguished from reality. So that is the overall point I want to make, is that it's counterproductive to sell the story as real. So the second related point is that the story is very widespread. All adults everywhere sort of close ranks, if you like, and there's there's this implicit idea of spoiling it. And this is another thing that parents and guardians need to be aware of. All young children eventually, of course, discover they've been duped and that it's just a story and Santa Claus doesn't exist. And there's this pressure to not spoil it for the younger children. And this is where the parents, I think, we parents need to step in. We need to eradicate that idea that anything is being spoiled. If we are all on the same page that we are enjoying a charming and delightful fantasy story, there's no concept of spoiling it. And indeed, it should be considered slightly perverse, because it is, to even come up with the idea that you're spoiling it for somebody by letting them know that it's not real, by pointing somebody towards the real and helping them make that distinguishment between fantasy and reality. The idea that that should be spoiling things should be seen as deeply sinister, because it is. We live in an age where truth is discounted, and one doesn't need to wonder why for too long when you factor in these implications with things like the Santa Claus story. So the third point I want to make is that this insistence that the story is true tends to instill within the minds of young people, when they learn that they have, of course, fallen for a story, and they realise that it is untrue, they'll be left with this sort of premise hanging in their minds that people lie, people do, and it's okay to do so, provided it's all for fun or for some allegedly good reason. If it's all justified by the group, then it's okay to talk about unreal things as though they're real. Again, I'm not sure that this serves any constructive purpose, and as parents, if we simply acknowledge the story as a story, we don't run such a risk. The next point I want to make is that the Santa Claus story speaks to the idea of compliance, teaching compliance, in that, according to the story, Santa Claus delivers presents only to children who are good, children who obey their parents. So the point here is that, or the point I want to make is that this is unnecessary. Most of us parents would readily concede that we're not seriously going to withhold any of those presents. We're going to try and use it as a bribery tool, perhaps, but we're not seriously going to withhold those presents. We're going to give them anyway. And I don't think it serves any useful purpose to try and attach behavioural outcomes to the provision of these Christmas presents, because most of the time, I'm sure we'd all like to think that we spend all year round encouraging our children towards appropriate and rational behaviour all of the time anyway. So the idea of making these presents and gifts that we exchange at Christmas contingent upon a behavioural outcome really doesn't need to be done, I would suggest. And if we want our children to grow up intrinsically motivated, whereby they just do the right thing because they know it's right and they choose their own values, this means our children grow up retaining a capacity to achieve their own happiness. Whereas if we train children to simply do what you ask them to and you reward them like an animal with presents and toys instead of food, you're simply encouraging extrinsic motivation. You're encouraging children to try to appease others, to value what others think of themselves, and obedience and compliance. So this really doesn't need to be done in the Father Christmas story. So it's an element of it that I would suggest that all of you truth seekers out there can dispense with. It's not going to detract from anybody's Christmas if we refrain from attempting to bribe our children with behavioural rewards. This leads in to the next point I wanted to make, which is the fact that the Father Christmas story and his wonderful benevolence of gifts speaks to the idea of enjoying the unearned. And we're all familiar with this cultural idea of everyone getting free stuff at Christmas. But it's worth reminding ourselves, as rational thinkers and truth seekers, that life is effort necessarily. Life is onward effort towards a goal, the goal being the maintenance of our life. It takes work to live, and we may have heard the idea that there's no free lunch, etc., etc. All of our values need to be produced. They need to be created. And the idea of becoming accustomed to and celebrating the unearned is arguably counterproductive when we bear in mind the facts of reality that I've just mentioned. And again, this doesn't really have to be a huge component of Christmas, and we can get around this by refraining from that automatic deluge of presents. If you happen to be wealthy enough to afford to shower your children with absolutely everything they might need, I want to suggest that it may be counterproductive to still do so. And it doesn't need to happen. We can also do things like encouraging making gifts for each other. And we can also do this, or we can mitigate against it, shall we say, by encouraging our children to value productivity, creativity, and their own productivity throughout the rest of the year as well. The next point I want to make, which kind of ties in with the first one about this pretense that something is unreal is real, is that if we cling to this idea of selling the story as true, we very much predispose young people, our young children, to mystical ideas, to claims that are unfounded by the facts of reality. And as those of you who are familiar with my work will know from elsewhere, that I label mysticism as the antithesis of truth, the ultimate truth destroyer, because mysticism holds that you can believe in things without reasons. Reasons are unnecessary. In fact, we invoke faith. We just believe. And this is one of the, I think, very significant outcomes or results of the Father Christmas story, is that it can leave young people as they grow up predisposed, if you like, towards believing in all sorts of stories that are sometimes wildly and outrageously in contradiction to the facts of reality. The last point I wanted to make is that parental trust is absolute gold and should not be squandered. The one thing that parents have when their children grow up and may wish to experiment with drugs and alcohol or any other kinds of behaviour, it's absolutely crucial that us parents maintain our relationship with our children, because arguably this is the only means of influence that we have with them, and that can't be overstated. So with relation to the Santa Claus story, if we lie to our children by pretending the story's real when it isn't, that's the lie. To share the story is okay, but to pretend that it's true is the problem. If we pretend the story is true, we can only compromise our children's ultimate trust that they have in us as they grow older, as they realize, of course, that the story's untrue. Okay, I realize I've been lied to all those years. It's not going to serve any constructive purpose. Whereas if we're completely open and honest with our children, if we welcome them into the club and say, yes, it's just a lovely fantasy story, we can retain that trust of our children, and we can continue to build a strong relationship where we lead our children to know what's true and what's real. And could there be anything more important than having the trust of your children's ear in matters where they're growing up and want to experiment in all sorts of behaviours? That's when we need to be on side. We need them to trust us with what's real and what's not. So I hope this helps. I hope that you all have a great time at Christmas. I hope you have a lot of fun with whatever children you have in your life, sharing the Christmas story, and maybe you'll get some value from what I'm saying here, and you might even go so far as to share with your children it is just a story, and enjoy it for what it is. Have a great Christmas.